Hey there, Rebecca here, your Vibe mentor. Let's talk today about narcissism. Is there hope for the person who exhibits narcissistic tendencies? In this video, I'm going to reveal to you the surprising ways that we might actually be able to help individuals who experience narcissistic traits begin to heal. So, what does it look like to love the unlovable? Together, we are going to crack the code to healing narcissistic tendencies. And yes, I am aware the literature says that a narcissist cannot heal. But the truth is, narcissism, true narcissism, is actually very rare. And the topic of narcissism has become very popular and mainstream in the last few years. People are throwing around labeling and diagnosis left and right without the professional capacity to be the one to diagnose. Some may have even deemed narcissists as evil or hopeless. Oftentimes they're referred to as worthless, and people even suggest subtly or overtly that they should be discarded like trash. And I think that's sad. Of course, I have to admit that at one time in my life, I also entertained that perspective, but I could feel in my heart and my soul, there just wasn't something right about that. And of course, I felt this way because I experienced a narcissistic relationship. And I want to be very careful when I say a narcissistic relationship, that's to suggest that the person exhibited narcissistic tendencies. I'm in no way labeling or diagnosing anyone here. My ex-husband, he checked all the boxes for narcissistic behaviors. And in the midst of the pain that I was experiencing, it finally made sense to me when I found an explanation of what might have been happening. Somehow, demonizing him helped me heal. It helped me understand what was so confusing and making me feel like I was losing my mind. It took a long time to extract myself from that situation. The trauma bond was very strong. And I even questioned at one point if we were twin flames because the magnetic connection was just indescribable. Although I'm really not quite convinced of the twin flame phenomenon either, but that's a topic for a different day, right? It was still incredibly difficult, regardless of the label, for me to separate myself from him. And at one point, I even used the example that it was like cutting my arm off to try to separate or to extract myself from this person in the life that we had created. But I knew it had to be done because the relationship was toxic and it was killing me. The constant aggression and criticism, it literally broke my spirit. My body was revolting through an autoimmune response, and I was exhausted, burnt out, and suffering from extreme stress responses in many ways. The gaslighting and the crazy making behaviors were intolerable. Exhausting is just it's not a big enough word to express the fatigue that I was feeling. My memory was severely challenged, and my nightly glass of wine or two for a coping mechanism was doing more harm than it was good. I had nothing left to give anyone anymore, not to my kids, let alone myself. And I ended up leaving and going back multiple times because of this trauma bonding or deep connection, or however you want to look at it. I can't even count how many times I left and went back and left and went back. So much so that there was so much back and forth that we even got married twice and divorced twice. Eventually, I was successfully disconnected from him, and it had been more than a year, and it required no contact. I had to block. I had to shut off all avenues of communication, or it just felt like a penetration of my energy. And I, in that time, was going to therapy, learning about trauma, becoming brain spotting certified, developing the trauma spotting method for myself, and really understanding, what does trauma look like? What does trauma do to the brain and the body and the behaviors, right? What are the 8 most common trauma responses that you'd be surprised that the vast majority of the world exhibits right now? And it really opened me up. I even found a therapist that I still see to this day weekly, who was brain spotting certified. And I became very aware of and adept at understanding and identifying a trauma response. And what was interesting was that as my healing was growing and deepening, I also started to see in others, not just my ex, but the world around us, how often we are exhibiting trauma responses. And it begged the question, are we dealing with narcissism or are we dealing with trauma? Over time, I began to see how the conflicts that we experienced, my ex and I, were driven by trauma and triggers. And I began to question, is he really even a narcissist? He certainly had a lot of childhood trauma. And as the healing journey progressed, I became a very different person. And I realized that before I had healed, I was a walking trauma response. Everything that I did was driven by survival, and many of my personality traits were either exaggerated or suppressed because I was trying to keep myself safe. They weren't who I was naturally. It was an avoidance of pain. I thought that the person I originally thought I was no longer existed. I even asked my therapist, what do I do with myself? Because I don't know who I am anymore. This new person is emerging. This old person has died, but I'm still in this in between of rediscovering and realigning to my original design. And so the person that I was made to be started to emerge, right? And while that was happening at the same time, my ex was also experiencing a health crisis, which led to a healing. He could no longer eat certain foods or drink any caffeine. It had gotten so bad at the peak of his caffeine addiction that he was having a latte with 5 shots of espresso in it for breakfast, and then at least 1, if not 2, energy drinks throughout the day. And then if heaven forbid he went on a road trip, there would be another coffee around dinner time, acid reflux, all sorts of responses to this excess of toxins in his body. And so when he finally quit putting the toxins in his body, he became a different person as well. And he was less reactive. He was less critical. His energy was more steady. I remember being around him after this and just feeling like it's his energy, his output was less threatening. It was safer to be around. And because of my trauma healing experience and my practice in helping others heal trauma every day, I began to see the trauma responses that were causing him to behave in the hurtful ways that he was. Even the caffeine, even the addiction, that constant hypervigilance, the need to always be on the go, to always be trying to outrun your fear of who people think you are, or the brokenness or the parts of you that you dislike. We're constantly running from them when we are unhealed. I could see why he was hyper defensive and connect that to his mother's hypercriticism and how she berated him when he was a child. I could see that when he felt vulnerable, it would bring out his shadow side. I could see that his becoming more critical meant he was overtired and overwhelmed. I could see that true intimacy was scary for him, that vulnerability was dangerous, and that he inside was just that little boy that needed praise and reassurance. Most importantly, I could see how our behaviors triggered each other's childhood wounds. That when he behaved in that way, I felt threatened. I became defensive. I closed off. I ran. I did my trauma response to avoid pain as well. And so what that meant is I could finally stop demonizing him. I didn't have to write him off as a hopeless case anymore. And it didn't mean that he was even healed necessarily, but rather that I was safe enough in myself and boundaried enough to be able to see the truth of who he was from a regulated nervous system state instead of dysregulated and triggered. I allowed myself to see that I was safe, and in my own safety, my protection that I don't have to count on anybody else for, that comes from me, allowed me to see him for who he was and not be triggered by that. It's possible to see how someone behaves and not need to demonize them. It's possible to give someone love and respect without hurting ourselves. It's possible to nurture the wounded little boy inside and see that the way he behaves is coming from a desire to survive and to be safe and to prevent pain just the same as I was. So when we start to look past the mask and the facade, we can see the hurt little boy or little girl and speak to their heart. Speak to the part of them that just wants to be loved, so that we can love them from where they are in a boundaried and safe way. A narcissist is still a human, and every human deserves love. But I highly suspect a vast majority of these people who we are claiming are narcissists, they're actually just traumatized. They're hurt little boys and girls just trying to keep themselves safe. In fact, every behavior that a human has, every action that we take, every word that we say, everything that we do is driven by a desire to stay safe, to survive. And so if we can step back and put down the judgment and the blame and the shame and start to see that their behaviors are a cry for help, they're coming from a place of unmet needs or wounding. I'm not suggesting that you hurt yourself to love them, but we can love them from afar in a boundaried way. The desire for admiration and validation, which is very common for a narcissist, it comes from a place of insecurity. Their tendency to get into superficial relationships is driven by a need for acceptance and approval. They want people to look at them and say, oh, wow, look at you. They need that approval that they didn't receive from their mother or their father. Their manipulation and control could be driven by a belief that they have no other option. This prison that they are trapped in forces them to become the shadow side of themselves. The push-pull relationship approach, avoid, that could be coming from a desire for love and the battle of the fear of intimacy and rejection and abandonment. That hamster wheel that keeps going round and round that says, I want this, but it's not safe. I want this, but I shouldn't. I want this, but what's wrong with them? Why do they love me? It's never about you. In fact, the way a person behaves is most often driven by their own internal environment, and very little of it is driven by the person on the other side of the table. Their idealization and abandonment could be a reflection of their internal chaos and how they deal with life on a daily basis, maybe even what they are dealing with in their own heads on a daily basis. As within, so without. Projection is very common for someone who exhibits narcissistic tendencies. And what they're doing is they're projecting their own internal environment on you. Maybe the way they treat the other is how they're treating themselves in their own head. The way they struggle with self-worth likely is an everyday battle to keep up a facade of inauthenticity. They feel threatened by others' goodness, and yet at the same time, they desire to be just that. That's why they're drawn to someone who is conscientious, empathetic, and generous. They want to be that person. There's a desire in them to be that person, and yet there's a knowing that they're not. You can see the push-pull here. Their lack of empathy was likely driven by pain and suffering that was so intolerable that they couldn't tolerate it anymore. Their only way to cope was to stop feeling. The good news is it's possible to cultivate empathy and awareness of these behaviors, so no one is a lost cause. The key is they have to want it. No one can force them to do it. But it starts with loving them and letting them know from a kind, compassionate, safe, and respectful way, hey, I care about you, and I can see that this is hard for you. I can't imagine that living this way is enjoyable. I hope that you find the help that you need because you deserve to be loved just like everyone else. Speak to their heart. The key is safety and love and respect from a non-judgmental, compassionate witness. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm in no way suggesting, I want to keep repeating this. I am not suggesting that you put yourself in harm's way. I'm not suggesting that you go running back to the narcissistic ex. But we can just see them where they are as the little boy or the little girl that's hurt and send a little love their way, even if it's just energetically. We can start by putting ourselves in their shoes. Seek to understand the horrible pain that must have been for them, that they must have experienced or lived through to become the person that lives like this. Our society alone is traumatizing right now. By the way, I highly recommend Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal. It's all about how society is traumatizing us right now. Our society alone is traumatizing, let alone the people who continue to hurt people. This is our opportunity to step out of the cycle of wounding by seeing people in a new light. I love the example in a native tribe. I'm wishing I could find the name of it. But when a person misbehaves, the tribe thanks that person for calling attention to a systematic flaw that needs the entire tribe's attention. The person acting out is doing so because their needs are not being met. Something is not working for them. And the entire tribe takes responsibility for correcting the systemic issue. In other tribes, they'll even put the person who stepped out in the middle of a group, and everyone in that group will send positive comments and statements their way. They'll say how amazing you are, how beautiful you are. Look at the thing you did for us. Look how talented and gifted you are. And in that sending love to them, they are healed so much so that they no longer want to continue the undesirable behavior. Ostracizing the wounded is the opposite of what is needed right now. Look at the drug and homelessness crisis that we are seeing in our country. It is a clear indication that a vast majority of our population is hurting. It's a systemic issue. And yes, that means it's difficult to solve. We're not going to be able to do it here today with one video. I wish it was that easy. But what we can do is start loving each other and know that every single person that you walk past today is experiencing equal to your challenges, even though they're not letting you see it. There is nothing stopping us from loving each other and sharing love with the people who need it the most. So if there's one key takeaway that I want to make sure that you receive through this message is don't write people off. Don't label, don't judge. Every single person deserves love and respect. Not one person is a lost cause. If our Creator can create everything we see here, our Creator can heal even a narcissist. But it starts with us. It starts with love. Everyone has a purpose. Everyone is valuable. Everyone is worthy. And the deep wounding that we may have experienced can become a superpower, especially when we learn how to heal trauma by leveraging the natural healing abilities of the body. This is profound, and I will not stop talking about it no matter how tired I get or no matter how many millions of times I've said it. I will continue to say it over and over and over. Trauma spotting, somatic healing therapies, they work. The body keeps the score. The trauma's in the body. When we have undesirable behaviors, we act in ways we don't want to act. We hurt people we don't want to hurt. We see people hurting us that we want to love, and they just don't know how to love us back. The key is the body, working with the body and understanding how to heal trauma. Going back, doing the shadow work, being willing to look at that memory where mom screamed in my face and told me all the things that were wrong. And at that moment, I just shut down. The moment of fracture is the moment we need to go back into. And most importantly, you cannot do this alone. What we're dealing with collectively, globally right now is a relational wound. Complex trauma is a relational wound. A relationship hurt us. And therefore, it is relationship that needs healing. And that means you cannot heal it in isolation. You have to have that compassionate witness. And trust me, I've tried. I am a trauma healing professional, and I still need my own trauma healing professional because I can't get all the way there by myself. You cannot heal in isolation. Time does not heal all wounds. And I know people don't like to hear that, and I'm sorry it's triggering. Yes, for a time it is needed, especially when we are people pleasers and overgivers, and we need to be able to hear our own voice and separate ourselves from others' energy, but it is not meant to be a perpetual state. You are made for collaboration. There are parts of your brain that literally die from isolation. We all have skills and gifts, but we also have weaknesses because it's an opportunity for collaboration. We're not meant to do this alone. I'm here for you. At the very least, if you have no one else, there are many ways to connect with me below. Otherwise, if you are ready to heal your trauma, you're ready, you're done. You've come to that place where you said, enough is enough is enough. I'm not doing this anymore. I want a new life and I can't seem to build it because I keep self-sabotaging, or there's some sort of thing hanging out in my blind spot. It's called trauma. Then you've got to join us for the More Than Enough Mastermind and Trauma Spotting Certification course starting Tuesday next week, August 15th. It's going to be amazing. We're going to cover all of the 8 trauma responses, the most common trauma responses. You will understand, what is trauma? What does it look like? What does it do to my brain and body? How do I spot it? How do I stop doing it? And I will teach you trauma spotting so that you can not only receive a healing session, but also give a healing session and practice and become a healer as well. And if you don't want to do the group one-to-one practice session, you just want to work one-on-one with me, of course, that option is below as well. You have the ability to live your dreams. Your desires were put on your heart for a reason. You have a purpose, that yearning for something more, being a seeker. What are you seeking? It is the wholeness. It is the purpose. It is the fulfillment. It is the healed version of you. That's where you find home. Not out there in the stars, but right here. Home is where your heart is. So I hope this has helped someone. If there's anybody else you know that could benefit from this, please do make sure you share this video. Otherwise, I would love to see you in the More Than Enough Mastermind Trauma Spotting Certification. 2 more days for the lowest payment plan of $151 per month. That will go away Sunday at midnight. All right. I love you, my friends. I'm sending so much love, and we'll talk soon. Take care. Namaste.